Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Roughly Chinese. I'm your host Mimi, and today I have two very special guests with me in the studio. We have Mauro and Jonis. Hi to the both of you. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the studio. And we have some very exciting events coming up, and I just wanted to talk to you both about some of the concepts that are going to be explored in the next few days, especially pertaining to the global south. And actually, right here, we have quite a tricontinental table, which is pretty awesome. Um, but before all of that, I want you to introduce yourselves to our audiences, let them know who you are, what you do, and where you're from. If you'd like to start, Mark.
Yes, so thank you, Mimi, for having us. I'm Mauro. I'm from Uruguay. I was born in Uruguay, but I've been living in between Brazil and Uruguay my whole life. And I'm a correspondent for Brasil de Fato, which is a media that has more than 20 years. I'm the correspondent in China and working as well in cooperation with some other medias like Telesur, which is also a Latin American media, and I've been here for 3 years in China already.
Wow. I think you're making really great strides because I always see you on viral news videos all the
In the
time.
Chinese social media, they've been inviting me to some the different parts of the country. Has been very important to learn about the country, to know the rural areas, the different regions of the country. But I have the privilege as well to be in some places like the parade, the military parade last time to celebrate the 80th war of resistance against the Japanese aggression. So that was like a high point of this year and this coverage in general.
Wow, I'm so jealous. That's so amazing. And what about you, Jonas?
Hey, so hello, Mimi and your viewers and Mauro. So my name is Jonis Ghedi Alasow. I am based in Johannesburg, South Africa, but my tasks are to coordinate a Pan-Africanism Today Secretariat, which tries to link up kind of people's movements, organizations across the African continent. And of course, for us, what Fidel Castro called the battle of ideas is extremely important. So um, it's a very big privilege to be here. Unlike Mauro, he's been here for 3 years. I've been here for 3 days. But I'm very happy to be here because every time one comes to China, you learn more things and meet interesting people.
Wow, thank you so much. And it's an honor to have you here with us in China always. And I wanted to talk to you both just about, especially today, because of the work that you both do, especially in a tricontinental landscape. What is the experience right now of telling the true stories of the global South? Do you feel like there is a growing united spirit? Do you feel like there's a connecting understanding of each other? I'd like to hear your experiences from the places that you both work in and are from.
I think, in general, from our perspective, the work we've been doing here is to solve a problem that we have for decades. So, for a long, long time, we only know about China through the media from the global north. And even the big media from our countries, like the corporate media from our countries, they also usually rely on the big corporate media from the global north. So our vision about China, as well as the African continent, has always been mediated by the vision of the perspective of others. So our intention here is to talk to Chinese people to understand China by listening to actually Chinese people, experts, and not only experts or of officials, but also people from all walks of life. You know, have been the privilege to interview peasants, farmers, and workers, people from the party, like the All Women Federation. Interview a leader from here, from Shanghai, from the district of Changning. So, and I think regarding your question, we have more and more attention, at least in Brazil, regarding China. Of course, China is now in the center of the talks. I have a friend that just came here for an activity in Xi'an, and he was coming back, and he showed me uh, a place where they sell the newspaper, I forgot the word, and all of the magazines were talking about China. So yeah,
Really?
but I think in Europe the interest or the interest that they had in China is different than the one we have in Brazil or in Latin America. So people are very excited first about the technology, of course, the advancements that China has been making, but also I think more and more about the achievements of the socialism with Chinese characteristics, because everyone was very impressed by the poverty alleviation campaign, which took out almost 100 million people from 2012 to 2020 out of poverty or extreme poverty. And more, I think people are interested in how the system, the Chinese system works to achieve these goals.
That's really, really good to know because that's clearly a huge shift, like you said, from the global north narratives. I think in Europe, the narrative is quite opposite. All these big achievements are seen as threatening or evil, or they're always twisted in some way. And it's really good to know that in Brazil and other places in Latin America, there's a growing interest and even excitement. And I think that has to do with the work that you do, of course.
Yeah, our perspective is to definitely work with the perspective of not seeing China as a threat.
Right.
This is like the main, the core intuition, the core intent of our work. We see China as a partner with the potential of teaching us, like in a good way, from their experience of several decades, having such great achievements. And I think us in Latin America, we should pay more and more attention to all the process and understand how these Chinese with socialism, socialism with Chinese characteristics work, but definitely not seeing China as a threat.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Jonas, I want to ask you too, because this is so important in the battle of ideas, right? And I want to ask you, in the places that you work and the places that you're from, what is the general idea right now about the global south and I guess also in terms of China and how people perceive China? Is it similar to that in Latin America?
Oh, so I'll start perhaps with a kind of broader African perspective and then give some South African examples because, I mean, the challenge that Africa has had, not just at the moment, but for a long time. I mean, this is 500 years of there's slavery, there's colonialism, and then even when colonialism ends and countries get independence and so forth, that independence didn't necessarily translate to dignity and prosperity for the African people. And this question about and that's really the fundamental contradiction on the African continent. How do you bring dignity and prosperity to the people of the continent? And there's been various that is something that people want. And the challenge that exists is that this has been not just difficult to do, but it has been actively undermined. I mean, when there's a guy who wrote a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I mean, the entire development of the global north has been at the expense of the global south. So when people talk about underdevelopment or developing countries, that's not a neutral thing. It happened for a reason. So this challenge is one that has existed for a very long time. And for a very long time, I mean, the African people as a whole are looking about what can we do? And the truth is, the model of Europe, the model of North America, I mean, this is prosperity at the expense of others. This is not something that we can follow. So the Chinese experience, a country that in a very short amount of time goes from being one of the poorest countries, competing with other African countries for being the poorest in the world, to being the threat that it is perceived to be by the West today, that is a very interesting story to any African. So first of all, I think there's a sense that things need to change. I think that sense is becoming more and more profound by the day almost. I mean, in Africa, not just do we have our own history, But we saw what was going on in Palestine on our television screens. It's clear now that even this pretense of liberal democracy and all these stories we were told were never true to begin with. If you can do that to the Palestinian people, what are you willing to do to us? And so there is really a search for what is the alternative. And here this question of the global south becomes really important, because at the end of the day, the global south is not a single thing. It is a huge, diverse mixing pot of experiences. But what they do have in common is, number one, the fact that historically we have been the victims of this kind of project of colonial expansion of the global north. But secondly, that we have to bring prosperity to our people without following their model. We cannot go and enslave anyone, and we don't want to enslave anyone. So this kind of Chinese experience is very important and interesting. There is a need for us to kind of not just learn from that, but to figure out what can those lessons be, how can those lessons be adapted in the African context. So there is a huge shift, I would say, across the continent, in particular in South Africa. I think the last few years, developments in kind of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, etc., in Palestine, those have really taken almost the kind of pretense that the West has solutions for the problems that confront humanity. It's now clear to everyone that they don't. And this is what's forcing everyone to think more and more about what can we learn from one another, how can we cooperate, and how can we kind of build a future that doesn't rely on us standing on the backs of others.
Wow, that's a very moving for you to say, because I think even in China there has been a perspective that, I mean, let's say like in the 80s and the 90s, there was a perspective that, wow, America is so great and America is like this thing to aspire towards. But I think what is becoming clearer than anything is that, like you said, America did it at the expense of others, at the expense of the global south over and over again, just like pillaging so many different places, right? And so I think everybody is becoming very aware and privy to that because, like you said, not just in Asia or China, but also in Latin America and Africa, there's this growing awareness that all these things that the US per se says about democracy and human rights or blah blah blah, how can they say that when they're funding a genocide in Gaza, right? And so it's hypocrisy, it's unreliable, and it's necessarily to find alternatives to learn from each other. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, and it kind of moves me to my next question about how the media landscape in Africa and Latin America is right now. I mean, that's a very broad statement, but just from what you've seen, just on a large scale, are they still being controlled or dominated by global north, media corporations? Like you said with Palestine, obviously there's so many lies being told in Western media. Is that also, is that story also being controlled in certain places because of global north media control? And on top of that, how are people finding alternatives to that as well? Yeah, all right, let's start.
Yeah, I think it is the landscape in Latin America is still very difficult, very terrible, as has been since always. We have in all of our countries like a very big concentration of the media in a few hands, and they all pay. They do an agenda that is specifically beneficial to the most powerful people or the most powerful class in each country. So the bigger the country, the more powerful the media, and the more attached to the interests of the ruling class. So in Brazil, particularly, I think is the case where this is stronger, and their interests, the interests of the elite in Latin America, are very influenced by the United States still. So we have our processes in Africa and Latin America, a process of invasion, of colonization, of pillage, of genocide, a huge genocide that is not acknowledged until today. So the people from Spain the colonizers from Spain and Portugal did huge massacres, and that is not recognized, and that has some impacts that still today we can see. And these media or this situation makes our elites, ours, easily influenced by the imperialist forces. So in the 70s in South America, we have a huge interference from United States through dictatorships, and the media there played a role together with the United States government. In Uruguay, which is my country, for instance, they discovered recently that some of declassified documents from CIA, some of them were published like word by word as op-ed in big newspapers in Uruguay. Wow. So exactly the same text. So this is like historical, our big media. This is the role of our big media. And I think our progressive governments didn't, some of them had the willing to change that because they know that this is a problem, but I would say the attempts were very, very fragile. So, for instance, we have some people's movements regarding people's communication, what we call popular communication, through, for instance, the community radios. There's a big movement in Latin America regarding that, and the governments, progressive governments, could give some support to them, but it has been very, very fragile. So we have some progressive media or popular media, but they struggle a lot, and we are kind of still alone, trying to support each other. I think this is one thing that is the positive side. More and more media have been established in Latin America and in Africa. For instance, we are partners with PATV, Pan African TV, with Telesur, based in Caracas, and with other medias in Brazilian landscape. But I would say it's still very difficult, but playing an important role. Just to finish, sorry, it's been a little long.
No, please.
I think we've been playing an important role, like for instance in Brazil, Fato, because we are in São Paulo, which is the biggest city, but we also have have some presence in 9 states of Brazil. So these branches, so to say, they have contacts with trade unions, with the indigenous movement, and so there's a lot of agendas from the grassroots that only we are able to, only us are able or willing to show, to talk about it. And in the other hand, we also prioritize, as well as the Fato I'm talking about now, the internationalism aspect. So we have correspondents in Cuba, here in China. We have a colleague, a comrade that was in the Sahel region, covering and make some documentaries as well. So it's a struggle. We've been advancing, but it's still a difficult situation, I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, it's really wonderful to hear the work that you're doing and the struggle that you are embarking on, because it is extremely important, and also to highlight the history there, because I think what many people, may not still be privy to, and I still uncover every single day, is how deep the hand of the American imperialist cultural and soft powers have tried to manipulate and change the media and the stories from within the places that we're from, right? And so it's very important to highlight that this has historically been happening for a very long time, and it's a continuous struggle. So thank you for that. And yeah, what about you, Jonis?
No, as I'm listening to Mauro, I'm thinking that he's giving a report on Africa, because a lot of this is similar. Because, and again, the media that we know today has its roots in our history of colonialism. Many of those newspapers, again, they've shifted, they've changed, but I think it's important to remember that in our societies, the role that media has played, mainstream media I'm talking about, is that of being the kind of mouthpiece and a propaganda machine for those who have power, which at the time was the colonizers. So this was the mechanism. You would find newspaper articles that are explicitly racist, for example. You would find newspaper articles that justify and legitimate the oppression and the exploitation of the African people, of the African continent, etc. So that's the first point I think that's important just to highlight, to say that this mainstream, what we call mainstream media, what we call corporate media, they have historically played a certain role in maintaining a problematic status quo. Today, even though things have changed to some extent, but that fundamental point has remained true for the most part, which is why this is why I'm saying there's a lot of similarities. I mean, in Africa, again, number one, the kind of domestic media in this is owned in South Africa, for example, 3 companies own, I think, 95% of all media. And I think that story is true for most parts of Africa. It's true for most parts of Latin America. So it's a massive concentration. That's number one. Number two, and this I think is a little bit of a shift, and I think it's important to remember, in kind of capitalist terms, media is no longer a thing where you become rich. It costs people to do media. It's not something where you are kind of making a profit, which means that a lot of that media it has to be funded. Like someone has to say, I want to spend my surplus, give it in order to try and influence people's opinion. And I mean, who has extra money lying around in Africa? It's the same people that colonized you, that exploited you, etc. They have extra money, and then they can invest that into media. So this is the second point that it's, I think, important, that the media is not just that it's owned by a small group, but that small group is really serving a very particular interest, which is about preserving privileges of a minority at the expense of the majority. This is kind of at the local level. So there's 2 challenges. I think that our friends in Latin America have really achieved more in building alternative media. I think we are learning a lot, not just from the Chinese experience, but also from Latin America on how to do some of that. So I think we have more work to do on that front. But there's, I think, 2 elements that are important and that are shifting slowly. Because the starting point is that you have this corporate imperialist media at a local level. When it comes to international coverage, for a very long time, I mean, even local newspapers don't have correspondents all over the world. They go and read Reuters and they reproduce it. So the international coverage ends up coming from not just the kind of local dominant groups, but from the international Western media. This is where I think 80% of international coverage is just a copy-paste of BBC or Reuters or these kind of Western platforms. In our experience, there's been really 2 challenges. One is that in terms of how the world is seen from a kind of broad international geopolitical perspective, like I said, for a very long time, the dominant voice has been Western media. Even if I don't wake up and decide to read BBC, if I'm reading a local paper, I'm still reading BBC. So that's the first problem about how the world is viewed. There, I think we are seeing some shifts. Over the last 5 years or so, both Russia and China have acknowledged that this front of engagement, this question about telling the stories of the world, is something that cannot just be left to Reuters and BBC. So there's a growing presence in Africa of Russia Today, CGTN, etc. And what that is helping is to kind of balance things out. It makes it possible for us to see other perspectives. We are seeing stories about China written by Chinese people rather than stories about China written by people sitting in London and Washington and New York. That's, I think, helping paint and this part of the answer to the first question about the global South, because it's starting to paint a picture of the world that is more realistic. I mean, China is not 3 people. This is billions of people. So it's important for us to understand that better. That's, I think, shifting. The other challenge, though, that we have, and this is a generic problem, is that, and this is our perspective, you see, on the African continent, we also have 1.4 billion people on the continent. The stories of the actual day-to-day lives of people is very difficult for us to find coverage in mainstream media and anywhere. And one of our tasks is what we call to elevate the experiences and the aspirations of the people and the organizations that they are building. Because often you will find coverage of big news items. There's an election in this country. There is a big natural disaster in that country. But that doesn't really help you understand the people. So that part, I think we have to do more work, and that's the hardest thing to do. It's 1.4 billion people, but we are getting there slowly.
Amazing.
Can I add just one more challenge?
Of course.
Because some years ago, like I would say, like at the beginning of 2000s, some people, I think in the progressive media and the people's popular media, were thinking that the internet will bring more will mean a democratization of the means of production of the communication, right? So I think we develop enough the tools to see that isn't the case, because what happened is we had a situation where everybody started to put out their blogs or their websites, and the web radios were a thing some time ago. But then now we have hyper concentration. We have in an even worse situation than with the media, because we had in our countries the big concentration, but now we don't own the main platforms where most of the people are being are using to read the news. There's some research that I don't remember the institute that made that is seeing that more and more people are informing themselves through Instagram, YouTube. And this is very, very problematic because, as we've seen, they are in the hands of very few people. In the case of, for instance, Telesur, which is our partner in Caracas, their channel has been taken down several times. There's loads of contents that people doesn't have more access, because you cannot upload loads and loads of content on a big television like Telesur. So we have this challenge in Latin America and Africa, which is something that doesn't happen here in China, because China, from the very beginning, understood that this thing about the digital sovereignty. And this is something maybe we can discuss further, but this is a really big challenge for us, because just to give an example, we have someone like Mark Zuckerberg defending his own interests, one of the most richest persons in the world, saying that we need more masculine energy in our platforms and something like that to be more friendly to Trump. And so this is a huge problem.
I mean, thank you so much for bringing that up, because that was actually exactly the next portion of the question that I was going to ask, which is, we talked about kind of the historical parts of the US having its hand on our media, newspapers, radio, etc., the infiltration. And then we move to the modern day where social media is, the new invention and everyone can be on it. And you think that it could democratize or have free speech. But really, I think now it is just like completely overwhelming. And also it's very difficult to sift through what is real, what is false, and what is, again, being controlled by these same corporate interests, right? And kind of to your point about how there are certain channels that are all owned by the three same media companies, it's exactly the same when it comes to social media now, right? Where it's Meta or it's X, with Elon Musk, like some of the worst possible people you would want. And their agendas are clear as day, right? They say these ridiculous statements, and then they are the ones who control, filter, shadow ban, create the algorithms that are meant to actually cause addiction to capitalism instead of actual knowledge. And so while I see people struggling and utilizing social media as best as they can, especially in the global south, how do we overcome that? How do we overcome knowing that and then actually potentially achieving digital sovereignty, right? And like you said, in China, it is so fascinating and incredible how it's done. And I'm going to admit, when I was a lot younger as a child, just when the firewall started to happen, I remember, because I grew up in Australia, I went to China and I thought, wait, why can't I use Google? Like, why can't I use Facebook? Why can't I talk to my friends,
Yeah.
whining and being a bit of a brat about it? And now that, I'm informed and I know all the histories, I'm like, that was actually essential. And it couldn't have any other way, actually. I'm like clinging on to the firewall. I'm like, never go away. So yeah, sorry, big question, but maybe Jonas, we can start with you.
No, sure. And really, it's really difficult because, again, this is a challenge, and it's actually not that straightforward. I mean, you can't, a big country like China saying, right, we are going to, because not just that China put the firewall there, knowing that the internet is not neutral. I mean, that was at the end of the day, the mistake that some of us made is to think this is a nice neutral place where we can have our counter-hegemonic voices heard. And in reality, it was never neutral. And again, when you do a bit of research, I mean, the funding to actually create the internet is connected to the United States military. Like, don't be shocked about the fact that it's not neutral. That was our own kind of misgivings. So, but not only did China put up the wall, which was a requirement, but it also then developed its own capacity. It's not like there's no social media in China. It has its own platforms. It has its alternatives that are in some cases better and more kind of user-friendly than the kind of Western alternatives. But China was able to do that because it's a big country. So in addition to the challenge here, I mean, I was in Lesotho a few weeks ago. Lesotho's population is 2.4 million people. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there are towns in China that are bigger than this entire country. It's hard for a country that size to follow this example. So I think we have this problem. Speaking for the kind of African experience, I think we have two problems. One is this one, and really I think it cannot be solved without doing a similar thing. You have to create your independence. You have to force for your own sovereignty around this, and you can only do that by drawing a line in the sand and saying, listen, we're not going to allow interests that are counter to the interests of our people to become the kind of hegemonic voices in our society. That's, I think, and you can only do that by using this firewall. But you cannot do that one country at a time in the African context. I mean, we have more than 50 countries. Really, this has to be done at an African level. So when we talk about Pan-Africanism and African unity, this is one of the ways in which that has to happen. You cannot have a kind of alternative, like a WeChat for every single African country. I think we need to come together and say, right, we're going to create an African platform that is not going to be controlled and run by these guys. So that's the problem. And at least if we're going to solve this, it cannot be solved in small pieces at a time. That's the first point. The second point, which I think is important to remember for the African continent, which is a double-edged sword, is the fact that as a result of our continued place as a site for exploitation rather than development, there are actually huge sections of the continent that don't have things like internet and electricity and so forth. I mean, when I go to my friends in Tanzania, if you go to the kind of a rural peasant, the way they get their information is from the radio. They don't have WhatsApp and internet and Facebook and all of these things. So the kind of actual like development of the continent, again, Niger was exporting all of its uranium for almost nothing to France. Every third light bulb in France is powered by uranium from Niger, but 70% of Niger does not have access to electricity. This kind of contradiction has to be overcome. So to some extent, in part as a result of the kind of active underdevelopment of the African continent, some of these challenges are kind of two steps into the future, because we do need electricity and then we need digital sovereignty. And really, I think both of those problems cannot be solved little bits at a time. They have to be solved at a continental level.
Absolutely. I mean, as you were saying that, it is absolutely horrendous how France is still powered by Africa, right? It's just absolutely ridiculous. And then I also think about China's revolutionary path, the fight against Japanese fascism, and how right now, even in the most rural parts of China, there's electricity, there's internet, it's all
5G.
so connected. Yeah, like I was thinking about the peasants in China who live stream from their farms, every day. And it is so starkly different because of the histories. And I am hopeful that Africa as a continent can also, achieve digital sovereignty as well as internet and electricity. What about you, Mauro? What are your further thoughts?
So I think in this case, we also, especially in this case, we need to look at China, because the interesting thing that I learned with Trump, which is from here from the house, and we make an interview with him, and he told me about the history of why, for instance, Meta wasn't here, because everyone in Latin America thinks, oh, China, because of censorship, doesn't
Yeah.
allow Meta to be here. But actually, what happened was that China said, put some conditions for Zuckerberg to install his business here. And one of them was the data from the Chinese people, it belongs to the Chinese people, so it needs to stay here. And there was some back and forth. I find some images in Mark Zuckerberg Facebook account. I think it was 2016, he was still coming to China, he was jogging in the Tiananmen Square, making, oh, so good to be back in China, like trying to get the business here done.
True, yeah.
But the thing that happened is that he didn't accept the conditions. I think is that China had the knowledge before having the actual capacity, the technology capacity. So they knew that it was strategic to have these conditions, even though their technology were not that advanced, was not that advanced. But this was one of the things that allowed China later to become a powerhouse in all of the aspects of technology. So I think we have a serious problems in Latin America with the same issue. For instance, now we talking about AI or storage the data of people. Some governments, for instance, the Brazilian government is making some projects that is called like the sovereign cloud, something like that. But this sovereign cloud to storage the data from people and everything, they are actually provided by the big companies. So it's already a product from Google. It's called sovereign cloud. So we have a big issue with that, because we are, again, in the same dependence, and we are talking about a very strategic factor. China has decided that the data is a production factor, is the fourth production factor around in, uh, in the socialism with Chinese characteristics. And we are not seen in the same way, in the same strategic way. And I think if there's any way out, I've been talking to some people from Brazil, some people here from China that are working together to come up with to discuss about this issue of digital sovereignty. And I definitely think that anything we should do together with China, because China is willing to help in that sense. Of course, China has also the companies, but I think is thinking on from this perspective of win-win, but also of the philosophy of the common prosperity. So I definitely think, and we've been seeing the development, the huge development in the chips industry and the AI industry with some elements of this perspective. For instance, DeepSeek, the fact that it's open source is completely different from the approach that we have in the companies in the US. So definitely, I think if there any way out for us in Latin America is together with China.
Amazing, amazing. I really like to hear that. And I actually thought, from a Chinese perspective as well, if there was some way that China could, help develop these independent platforms and allow these social media networks to thrive independently and provide, a lending hand when it comes to digital sovereignty, I think it would also connect Chinese audiences to the everyday stories from Latin America and Africa as well, which I also think is very necessary and important right now, or has always been. Right now in China, there is a growing fascination and desire to learn about the global south. I think as everyone in the world is repeatedly seeing the patterns and the violence that the US constantly perpetrates, all the rose colored glasses are kind of off, right? And so in China specifically, especially, in the 80s and the 90s, there was that time of, oh, wow, we're looking towards the West. Everybody was, right? That's when they were at their strongest, right? But then now that the mask has fallen off, Chinese people are like, we actually don't want to. All we hear about you guys is drama, right? It's like drama from Trump and drama from this, and this genocide you're funding and this war that you're funding, etc. And so Chinese people are really wanting to and very curious to know about the rest of the world. I mean, I wanted to ask you both, what are some responses that you've seen from Chinese audiences, to your work? Because you are very famous on Chinese social media. How do people kind of respond to you? And what do you think are some ways for Chinese people to learn about everyday stories, like you said, from your countries?
Well, we have some challenge there, of course, which is the language, and we have, for instance, in Brazil, the Fato, we are making the effort to translate our main stories into English, and particularly this year we had some kind of a big achievement, which was being in the first Latin American media to have an official account on Chinese social media. So we managed to have an account on WeChat, Weixin, and we are making an effort to choose some of our stories, mainly the stories regarding Brazil and Latin America, not the stories that I may hear, because this is for our audience in Brazil and Latin America, or even in other countries, because we also translate to English. But the stories about Brazil and Latin America now in Mandarin, so people can have not only the information about our region, more information, because CGTN also have some correspondence there, but from our perspective, because we are partners with the Chinese media, all of them. But it's, of course, we have our differences, natural different perspectives. So we've been making this effort because our main goal when we arrive here is to talk about China, the real China, to our audience, to show Chinese people talking about their country.
Yeah.
Now we've been here for a while, so now we want to add this flow too.
Yeah.
So from Latin America to China is of course a big challenge, but I think more Chinese people will naturally start to pay more and more attention to stories in Latin America and Africa too, because the trade is growing. I don't know if you saw, but there was some time ago, it was the first time that the trade with China and the G7 was smaller than with the global south in general. So, and I think this is a trend that will continue. And so naturally, with visas, free visas for people from Latin America to come here, we have now 5 countries that can come with a free visa. So I think, and I hope the exchange grows more and more, and we need to be prepared for this, like having more Latin American media here. There's a program by which some media came here for some months with together with the MFA, and yeah, I think there's some medias in Brazil people can follow in Latin America, especially Brasil de Fato, Telesur, and other partners. Unfortunately, they're mainly in Portuguese.
Got it. Wow. I'm really happy to hear that. And I think, like you said, the flow and the reciprocity is very important. I've been hearing about some programs where there are now Chinese influencers who are being invited to Brazil, who go to Brazil, meet local people, and also take videos or vlogs and stories about their experience. So the cultural exchange is very important because there's also political exchanges happening between our countries as well, right? What about you, Jonis?
No. I mean, just to add what you guys are saying, because that part I think is growing. I mean, we talk, and it's true. I mean, you put on the news and you see the umpteenth war that is being created artificially
Yeah.
because there's natural resources that people are trying to plunder. I mean, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or Palestine, I mean, there's no shortage. Libya on the African continent. These are all examples of this. That's one element, and I don't want to downplay that. But I think there's also kind of an economic shift in the world, which I think is not negligible. My father's Somalian, and that generation, Somalia was a country in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, even till today, it's very difficult to survive there. So when he was looking for where can he go and kind of make a living, he was looking to Europe and North America. That generation still thought, like you were saying, that if I need to survive and put food onto the table for my family, and I can't do it in Somalia, then, well, let me go to Germany or let me go here or there. My generation is looking to China in that way. I mean, there are people that similarly, economically, were not able to, for reasons that weren't their fault, weren't able to survive in Africa. Many of them are the ones that teaching English in China now and this and that. So there's really just more exchanges. And I do think people-to-people exchanges is really one of the best ways to learn about one another. Of course, media is important. Of course, kind of like understanding how the world is changing is important. But at the end of the day, us sitting here like this is a much better way to get to know one another. And that's happening more and more. And like I think all of us are saying, there's an increased appreciation for two factors. One is that to continuously look to the West has positioned itself as the kind of leaders of the world. But if we allow them to keep leading the world, the world will be destroyed. And everyone is starting to see that. So the first point is that this kind of like idea that is an example to be followed is falling away more and more. And there isn't no one is saying we are replacing the West as an example with something else. We are saying that we're going to have to figure this out for ourselves. And that, I think, these exchanges are very valuable. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done on the African continent, just for our own purposes, for us to understand one another better, because this language issue that exists between individual African countries and China also exists within Africa. I mean, there are literally thousands of languages in Africa, difficult to kind of communicate, to develop this kind of common identity. But that's one element. We have to improve this kind of point I made earlier about elevating the experiences, the aspirations, the dialogue between people. But that absolutely has to happen throughout the global South. We have to increase the amount of dialogue between Africa and Latin America, between Africa and China. That is starting to happen at an economic level. It's starting to happen at a state level. BRICS is becoming more and more of something that people are looking to provide leadership in the world. Whatever those contradictions are, people are identifying that as a more likely source of leadership than the US-led empire. But there's also a need for us to kind of strengthen the people-to-people dialogue. And that is, I think, where the most work needs to happen. I think what Brasil de Fato is doing, what you guys are doing here is really kind of like leading the pace for but we need more of that. We need to multiply that kind of dialogue, because I think no one has the answers, but I do think that dialogue is the most likely source of answers for the world.
Absolutely. And I think people to people exchanges are my favorite way to do it. You know, like you said, there's a depth in understanding and there's a way to really communicate despite potentially like language barriers, etc. But there is still a way to connect and understand each other that I think is very vital and very beautiful. Um, I wanted to move to a little bit of still related, but a little more lighthearted, I guess. But in this people to people exchange and in this conversation that we're having, I wanted to ask you both about some everyday experiences that you may have had in China that, kind of have allowed you to understand China on a deeper level. I mean, you have seen so much of China, potentially more than me at this point, but, you've been to the countryside, you've been to obviously many different cities, you've been to political events. So I kind of wanted to ask you if there's a kind of memory or story that really moved you, that you felt like gave you a deeper insight about China.
So I have three anecdotes quickly,
Wow!
but the first one is, and this is, you'll find strange. The first thing I found surprising when I came to Shanghai, because you see people walking in the streets, and many people they have their phones out, etc. And this is really strange for me, for people to walk in the streets with their phones. Why? Because I come from Johannesburg in South Africa. And South Africa, this is between South Africa and Brazil, there is this very sad competition about which is the most unequal society in the world. Mm-hmm. I think South Africa is just about winning, but this is not a trophy that we want.
Right.
It's an extremely unequal society. So there's a little suburb of Johannesburg called Sandton. Sandton is the richest square kilometer on the entire African continent. Wow. It's extremely wealthy. But right next to it, there is a township called Alexandra, no running water, people living in shacks. There's like really no infrastructure. So you have this huge contradiction. And as a result of this kind of contradiction in South African society, if I walk with my phone out in the streets, someone's going to run past and take my phone. And really just the problem of the inequality. It's not that South Africa is poor. It's that the wealth that exists in South Africa is so concentrated that when I walk in the streets with my phone, someone has to take it so that they can sell it for 50 Rand down the road and go buy bread and survive. So that's the first, this contradiction between where I come from and what I was seeing here. The second contradiction or just thing that I found strange is, again, you walk in the streets of Shanghai, and I understand Shanghai is not all of China is Shanghai. It's quite different. Yeah. But you walk in the streets here, and it's how quiet it is because of all the electric vehicles. Again, if you are in Kampala or Dar es Salaam or Accra, you cannot have a conversation with someone because of the amount of, firstly, there's a lot of fumes, but there's also just the noise. And again, this contradiction and because the vehicles, most capital cities in Africa, those are old European vehicles that got dumped in the African market. So it's a second-hand car that when the European Union passed legislations to say that we want certain greenhouse gas emissions, those cars, they didn't stop greenhouse gas emissions for the world. They just took those cars that produce too much greenhouse gases and dumped them in some African country where they are now producing greenhouse gases while I'm talking to my friends. So this contradiction, again, between the kind of technological advancements of China on the one hand, and the fact that that most vehicles in most parts of Africa are vehicles deemed not good enough for the West that are now being driven on our continent. The third story, I'll be quick, we went, I think at the beginning of last year, not to Shanghai, but to Ruijing. And it was really fascinating. And I'll tell you why. I was with a friend of mine. Him and I both grew up on farms. So we were, we have that in common. We used to wake up early in the mornings and milk cows and things like that. So we come from rural South Africa. So when we arrive at Ruijing, we are told that this is rural China. And we refuse to accept that. Yeah. It's like, this cannot be rural. There are roads here. There are lights in the streets. There's internet. How can you tell me this is rural? Because the rural we know is that you have to go on a gravel road for 100 kilometers before you reach a tar road, which another 100 kilometers down the road is going to bring you to a town. So what is, I think, the common thread with my little anecdotes is that there has really been tremendous changes that I think are positive in China. And I'm comparing these to the African and South African experience. And I do think it is important to be clear, and this ties into what Mauro was saying. China didn't get to where it is by itself. It didn't just happen like this. It wasn't an accident. There was a revolution here in China. We are here talking about 80 years of the defeat of fascism. But in a few years' time, we will be celebrating 80 years since the Chinese Revolution. That revolution, the thing that it did, you can fight about it, you can agree, you can disagree, that's not my point. The point here is That revolution was a group of people who, A, took political power, and they said this political power is in order for us to bring dignity to our people. The subjects of that power, the people in whose interest that power was not one or two people, was not a little group of elites, was the Chinese people. And that project was something they knew they can't do overnight. They said, we need a project for our people. Even if it takes us 80 years, we want rural areas with decent roads. We want schools for our children. We want proper healthcare. We want those things. And it's that concept of revolution, which I think is the most important lesson that we have to learn in Africa. To say that, that political power must be used, number one, for the benefit of the people as a whole. In 1955 in South Africa, there was a document that was produced as part of the liberation struggle called the Freedom Charter. And in there, it uses that kind of terminology. South Africa should be for the people as a whole. That's what political power needs to be for. And number two, we need a project for our countries and for our continent. We need to have a vision about where are we going. We cannot be here just because we like to be called president or minister. That cannot be the purpose of our existence. Political power has to be for the people and for a purpose. And that purpose has to, and this is, I think, a lesson to be learned here. And my little anecdotes, when I thought about what do I find interesting about China, it's these small little things, but I think they trace back to that much bigger question, which is the political question that Mauro also raised.
Wow, I love all those stories. I love all your anecdotes, and I genuinely feel that what you're saying is a portrait of, like you said, the changes that have occurred because of the revolution and since the revolution. And it cannot be denied. That cannot be denied at all. I think sometimes what is very interesting is that now China has this, shiny image in all media across the world. And people, like you said, are so fascinated and like in awe of what China has been able to achieve. But I always want to draw back attention to where China came from at the beginning, right? And I think that links the global South struggle together because China, like you said, used to be one of the poorest countries in the world. And just a few decades ago, China was also, like you said, the sounds and the smells and the mist and the fog and everything. That was all because it has been in development, since the revolution, and it has become what it is today because of all these moves that have benefited the people. I mean, I remember as a kid when I would spend time here, I remember that the sounds as well, it was like honk 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 and beep beep beep, and very very chaotic, and the traffic was really insane and the smog was very very strong. And then I came back slowly, throughout the years, and my senses would be so different. I would just feel this very like bodily shift where I would come here and I'd be like, it's so quiet. Like, what's going on? And these are because of the changes that benefit the people every single day. And, even the anti communists here, which they exist in China, they cannot deny that it is because of the Communist Party that these changes have occurred. And so it's very important to note that this is political progress that has happened as well. So this leads me to my final question, and thank you both for just being such amazing speakers and conversationalists, and you've taught me so much. But I wanted to ask finally how you think the Global South can link together and be stronger, in our diversity and our differences and our multipolarity, but also in the commonalities in our histories and in our struggles as well. Wow. Big question.
Yeah, it's a very, very big question. I would just say that I think Jonis mentioned a little bit of this. Of course, we have to do everything at the same time. So strengthening our new tools of coming together for a stronger global South. So we have BRICS. China has been building together with Russia and Central Asian countries, the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think all of this needs to be improved. And I think they will, because there's willing among all the parts. But definitely talking about Latin America, we should solve our internal issues it's urgent to address some very problematic things that we have. So, for instance, in Brazil, we have in Brazil we have the police that kill the most people and is the force that is more killed as well. So it's a very violent society, and even the progressive forces, I think they don't discuss this enough. And the thing is that this violence is not just violence because it's violence and they have a lot of guns. It's deeply rooted in the history of Brazil, the history of colonialism, and the history of racism. Because the most people that die of these by these guns are black people, young black people, poor people. So we have a lot of these issues, and this is not a separate thing, you know. I think while we keep having these problems, we keep having our big companies contaminating our soil, like the environmental issue, the patriarchal system that we have in our countries. All of this needs to be urgently addressed because we cannot be together in a project that aims to the common prosperity if you're not aiming for the common prosperity in our all local regions.
Yeah.
So I think this is the main thing. Sorry, it's a very big question.
I
I'm sure
know,
there's
I know.
a lot of aspects, but I think this is one of them.
Thank you, absolutely. And you just have to come back for another episode to dive deeper into it, right? What about you, Jonis?
No, so I also might need another episode, but I
Yeah,
do think
both
this
of
is
you, come on, part two.
look. I think that point is true. The ability for the global South to kind of come together is a necessity. I do think if that doesn't happen, the alternative is almost too worrying to think about, because we cannot, again, I mean, you watch, it's not, yes, there's the Palestinian question, but as we are sitting here in Sudan, you have millions of people displaced as a result of a war that isn't a necessary war. This is not a war in order to defend a principle. This is a war that is not, it's no good for anyone. I can tell you a similar story about the Congo and about 10 other places. So if we don't want Palestine, Congo, and Sudan to become the story of the world, then we have to come together as the global South. So number one is that this is not it's not a debate or should we not. I think it is an existential question. If we cannot pull the global South together around questions of peace and dignity and prosperity for everyone, then the alternative is a disaster. The second point, in order to do that, is I think we have to deal with these contradictions. Because, of course, we need more. We need more better communication. We need more better trade. We need more better development. We need roads. We need hospitals. We need electricity. I mean, the example I gave about electricity, the electrification of the African continent is an urgent task. I think, though, we have to remember that the purpose of development, of growth, is for the benefit of people. We don't want economic growth because we like statistics. We want economic growth because that is something that is going to help the people, help the country, help us be able to do certain things. Africa is not a poor continent. I mean, the Congo Basin is fertile enough to produce food for the entire African continent. At the same time, if you are looking for malnutrition and hunger, you will also find it in Africa. The most fertile place in the world where you can grow food has hunger. Why is that? This is not a problem of science. This is not a problem of capacity. This is a problem of a neo-colonial, problematic so-called global order. That has to be overthrown. We have to resolve the contradictions in our societies in order to make sure that when we do things like people-to-people relations, like trade, like cooperation, etc., that it's for the benefit of the people in our respective countries. But I think the last point that I want to make, which I think is important, and it kind of ties the two together. So on the one hand, the alternative to unity of the global South, I think, is the end of the world. Two, in order for us to achieve that, human beings has to be the object of why we are doing what we are doing. We're not doing things because we are bored or for fun. We're doing it because at the end of the day, we want to end hunger. We want to have education for our children. We want to have healthcare for sick people. That's the goal that we have. And this is, I think, that has to be the kind of the goal of the global South. We have a common history. We have a common world that we're inheriting, but we also have this kind of destination. But I think it is important to remember that we are not advancing this project in a neutral space. There is a counter-offensive against the idea of the global South. Sometimes we are very critical. I'm very critical about what we are achieving, how we haven't achieved certain things. Sometimes it's because of our own mistakes and our own weaknesses and so forth. But sometimes it's because of this counter-offensive. And I think we have to not be blind to that counter-offensive. 80 years ago, we are marking the defeat of fascism. I think maybe we need to rephrase that, because I don't think fascism disappeared 80 years ago from the planet. And maybe what we have to deal with is the construction of the global South, when that spirit of fascism that had a setback 80 years ago is at risk of returning. And I think we have seen what in Palestine and many parts of the world, there's no qualms about reintroducing fascism and fascist tactics in order to avoid this global South project. So I think we have to understand the context. We have to remember why we're doing what we're doing. But at the end of the day, we have no choice but to succeed, because failure is not just our failure, but it's also a failure for future generations.
Can I add just one point?
Of course.
Because I also, we talk about these problems of racism, patriarchalism, and of course we have a huge issue of class struggle as well. So I think this is more and more need to be mentioned in dialogue with, especially with China. And if you think with about Vietnam as well, it's a good example. It's a different type of socialism, but we have also to remember how brutally attacked they were, like, and they come up with a society that doesn't have the achievements of the ones that China have, but they still they came up out from a situation that was very, very brutal and delicate. But I think in our countries, and I think there is I know there in all of our countries there are a struggle for socialism, and I think for us it's important to highlight that the achievements that China had in these decades was because of socialism. And now, even as a media, we have a challenge now, because we have more and more influencers coming here to China, and they strategically erase the word socialism in their reports, in their videos. They say, oh, it's so beautiful, a lot of new technologies, advancement, big buildings, etc., and the culture. It's important for China, because China has been attacked, and I think it will continue to be attacked. So it's important to China to have more people from all parts of the world coming here and to show China in any way. But from our side, I think we need to make the effort to highlight the role of socialism in this, because it's not to copy. I think Chinese people are very keen, very preoccupied. They are concerned to not export. They always say we're not trying to export our model to any country. But from our side, I think we should not try to import or try to copy, but to understand that all of these achievements of common prosperity is because of socialism. And sometimes, just to wrap up, there's a lot of people in Brazil that see China and say, we should do this or that. And it's kind of innocent, because they think it's just to move something here and there and you will have the same results. So I think more and more for our countries in Latin America and Africa, it's important to highlight the aspect of or the centrality of socialism in the achievements of China.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for your clarity, for your insights, and I've learned so much from the both of you. I really hope you can come back for another episode. I wasn't joking.
Thank you very much, Mimi.
Of course. And thank you everyone so much for watching this episode of Roughly Chinese. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know what else you'd like to discuss.